So before I bring Billy and Mario forward, I'd like to give you a couple of highlights about what's happening at VPP. As you know, we're coming to the end of 2018, and we have 2 investments that are completing their first year, and we're having great success with them. The first is Higher Achievement. It serves middle school students in 4 states with year-round expanded learning and mentoring. VPP's investment in Higher Achievement provides a unique opportunity to expand on Higher Achievement's positive outcomes by further enhancing data collection, performance management, and evaluation capacity to advance its mission to close the opportunity gap in the middle school years. I just did a review with the chairman and the executive director, and they have been extremely pleased with the partnership that we have with them. The second is Relay Graduate School of Education. It's a national accredited nonprofit institution of higher education, and its mission is to prepare teachers and school leaders to develop in all students the academic skills and strength of character needed to succeed in college and in life. This is an investment that we have with Ed Forward DC and the A. James and Alice B. Clark Foundation to bring Relay to DC. They have wanted to be in this area, and we finally found the opportunity to get funders to come together to provide the resources needed. And they're working with several of the top performing charter organizations in DC, and 2 of them are VPP Investments, KIPP DC, and Appletree Institute for Education Innovation. They're also working with DC Public Schools. So we're, as I said, encouraged with the progress that's been made and expect even a greater year in their second year. So a lot of you know that we've been working several years now in Prince George's County, Maryland. And so we're leading the Ready for Work Collaborative in the county, and it's to prepare young people to successfully graduate high school, career, and college ready. So during the school year 2017-18, Ready for Work served over 1,434 students at Suitland High School through our Youth Connect model. We coordinated a summer pilot program for 38 students at High Point High School to help them successfully transition from middle school to high school. And now we're working with the school leaders to launch Youth Connect at High Point. So tonight's program is one of the many programs that we do to bring people together. We believe that we have to change the ecosystem to really improve young people's lives. So we need government, business, philanthropy to come together to make that difference. And so we have Mario and Billy, who've been involved in this work, trying to make philanthropy much more effective. So they're going to focus on the good, the bad, and the ugly of transformative change. So join me in bringing them forward.
Billy wanted me to be the ugly of the good and the bad, so we had to pick our spots. So in the lights, so when you got a bald head, it sort of glows when you get the lights going on. Just as a little beginning, thank you. I mean, just accept Carol's thank you, but for Billy and I, thank you for being here. And hopefully this opens up an open discussion. The less we talk formally and the more we talk as a group, I think we'll actually get a lot more out of it. Real quick, Billy and I go back to 1993.
Yeah.
And we had a mutual friend, Steve Denning, who connected us. And we've been in and out of each other's lives in different fashions probably ever since, and have developed a very close friendship, safe to say. He's put up with me through a lot of process, and I've learned enormously from him. We thought in starting off, I would start off on the definition of transformational change and give a couple examples, then turn it over to Billy, because he's actually lived it in several different ways, and I think his story will be really compelling. But if you get my notes here, just before the meeting, I went back and did a quick search online and said, what does that mean? And the definition was a shift in the business culture of an organization resulting from a change in the underlying strategy and process that the organization had used in the past. Okay, pretty wonky description. But what it really is a change in culture. More than anything else, transformational change is a fundamental change in the culture of the organization. I think we're doing okay. There's a in the same thing I looked up, there's over 25,000 books written on the issue of transformational change. And one estimate says that at least 1 in 3 fail. My experiences would say it's probably 2.5 out of 3 fail. I think 1 out of 3 is being very kind. It's probably an academic studying something from a distance, you know. When I look at the issue, I can give 3 vantage points of examples. And I can give many examples of good and bad and ugly, but right now, I've been really fortunate. I was here for a long time, and I moved back to Cleveland, where I'm from. I'm now on the board of the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, which is fairly significant hospital system, 62,000 employees. We're in countless states. We're in Abu Dhabi, we're in London, we're in other areas. And when Toby Cosgrove took over 15 years ago, who just retired, he really retired as one of the most notable people in the health field. He took it on to transform the clinic to become a much more transparent and outcomes-focused institution. To put that in context, enormous progress was made under his leadership, and that transformation is still ongoing. To just put that in the context of an organization that size. I was involved in a school in Ohio that I had the chance of working with, and it really was a legitimate transformation in my case. And I watched a head of school come in 2007 to a school and literally transformed the way kids were received and treated and taught over a 10-year period. And it truly was I can step back and point to an actual, really transformational change because of the change in the culture, in the nature of the faculty, and the way people were just embraced. And the third is actually VPP. And it's Carol's credit, because Venture Philanthropy Partners started. It was designed to be a philanthropic investment organization. It was designed to work with individual organizations and help those leaders of those organizations build very strong nonprofits that have much greater impact for the people or causes that they dedicated their lives to serve. And that's still there in VPP. What Carol actually did was take it to another level. And Carol and the team to allow VPP today to become a collaborative investor, a collaborative model developer, where we can work within regions as an institution and see a whole different degree of change by pulling people together. That's very difficult to do. We'll talk about that a little later. In that space, there's a lot of the bad and ugly in that space nationally. But Carol deserves the credit for making that cultural transformation with the team, and that's another example. But I'd like to turn it to Billy because I've watched, I think Kathy's here someplace, we've known Billy for a long time, and we've watched Share Our Strength as huge fans. I think we met, 5 years after you formed it? And it's gone through its own metamorphosis under Billy's leadership, but it's gone through actually transformations. And I think having Billy discuss that firsthand would be remarkably informative. Over to you, buddy.
Great. Well, thank you, Mar. And I will keep this brief as well so that we can get into the conversation as quickly as we can. First, I just want to say thanks both to Mario for his vision behind VPP in the first place and to Carol and the whole team at VPP for just the absolutely incredible job they've done. As somebody who was very involved in the early days and then was on the board, stepped off, and has been reconnecting and understanding the impact you've had, it's really nothing short of amazing. Mario talks about being in schools that have had a transformational impact. Share Our Strength's work is mostly based in schools as well. And I'll tell you about an experience I had in my own son's school. I've got a 13-year-old. And last year when he was in 7th grade, this teacher, Mr. Horowitz, asked me if I could come and talk to the class about the work we do at Share Our Strength. And because I'm a politically correct, involved parent, I of course said yes. And I said yes so fast I hadn't even checked with my son, not realizing that this would become the most embarrassing day of his life, just by virtue of me showing up in the classroom. The clues for me were when he woke up in the morning, he came out of his bedroom and I was sitting in the kitchen, and he looked at me and he just said, "Tell me you're not wearing that shirt." And it was just like, it was this shirt. And I said, "Yeah, I am, buddy." And he said, "Dad," he said, "you're coming to my classroom today." He said, "Do me a favor." He said, "Just before you walk into the classroom," he said, "just stop, take your fingers, and rub down your eyebrows. Sometimes they go every which way." I was like, good to know. Nobody had actually confided that in me up until now. And then he said, "Dad, there's one other thing." He said, "Please pay attention really carefully to my classmates and really listen." He says, this is the way he talks, he says, "I don't know if it's because you're an older parent, but I've observed that sometimes when I say thank you, you say, 'I love you too.'" He said, "So really, really listen carefully." I said, "Okay, I will." And by this point, of course, I'm ready to cancel the entire thing. But the reason I tell you this is because the more pertinent lesson that I think relates directly to venture philanthropy partners and the investments you've made is while I was talking in class, one of the other little 7th graders raised his hand, and he said, Mr. Shore, he said, at Share Strength, have you found a way to serve families and children without embarrassing them? Which is really an amazing question. And another little boy said, at Share Strength, do you get to know and see the children that you serve, and do they feel seen or do they feel invisible to you? And I point that out because when you look at the roster of organizations that VPP funds and supports and has helped grow, these are organizations that see these kids. That's what's so unique about this incredible portfolio of investments. These are kids who are seen and who know they're not invisible. So the work you're doing, I think, is just important. I know these organizations well. I've worked with many of them for a long time. And that is unusual to have a kind of portfolio where you are really in contact in an authentic way with the people that you're trying to serve. In terms of the work, as Mario generously describes the transformational work of Share Our Strength, I would just say that our very, the concise version of our history is we started out as a grant maker to hundreds of other nonprofits. We were much better known for many years for the entrepreneurial ways in which we generated revenues rather than what we actually did with them, because we had kind of a corporate marketing partnership at the core of it. But about 10 years, and that was satisfying to everybody we worked with, except for those of us at the core of the organization, who were asking ourselves every day, what kind of impact are we having? Is the glass half empty? Is the glass half full? And so we got very focused about 10 years ago on something that the writer Jonathan Kozol says, which is pick battles that are big enough to matter but small enough to win. Les Silverman will remember this because Les helped guide us through a process in which we spent weeks. It felt like years, but I think it was only weeks. And Les wisely guided us through this process in which we talked about, for us, what was big enough to matter but small enough to win. And we realized in all the areas and places we were working, when it came to kids who were hungry on a chronic basis in the United States, that was a solvable problem. That was a winnable battle. And the transformation occurred, Mar, when we did something that almost everybody we worked with was against. All of our partners, all of our funders, virtually everybody, which is we said we're going to put a stake in the ground and say we can end childhood hunger by a time certain, and we're going to actually hold ourselves accountable to that outcome. We're going to measure it in the following ways. And although it's frankly preposterous that one little organization like ours would say we're accountable to that outcome when there's the federal governments and state and local governments and all these other organizations, everybody else in our space was kind of going like this. Well, we did our thing, but it was, the state legislature dropped the ball, or, Catholic Charities was supposed to follow up, or whoever. Everybody was blaming somebody else. And we said, well, the buck's got to stop somewhere. And when we did that, it just had an absolutely catalytic impact on all of our stakeholders. And we made a number of investments. It was a huge culture change because not only were we going to be accountable, but everybody who worked in the organization was going to be accountable in very specific ways to that macro goal. And that frankly made a lot of people uncomfortable. The last thing I'll say, and then we'll move on, is when we first presented this idea to all of our colleagues in the anti-hunger space, maybe 60 of them in a big ballroom somewhere here in town, and had our PowerPoint and our critical path and our theory of change and all those things, about 59 of the 60 were just passionately opposed. These were anti-hunger advocates, mind you. And they said things like, well, what about populations that are not children? How can we not serve them? And what if the economy changes and that creates a reversal? And what the subtext that I was really hearing was a almost cultural discomfort with being held accountable to a very specific goal when you can go from kind of like beginning to end in the space that we're in with everybody thinking you're a good guy or a good woman for your entire life. So why risk all that by measuring it? Now, Mario's the guru of performance imperative and measurement and impact, so I'm going to lateral the ball back to you, Mar. But for us, that was the big catalytic change. And I guess the last thing I would say is The other thing that strikes me as so important about the work we're doing just days after the national election we've just had is, Americans are just so desperate for evidence that progress is possible. And there's so much division, and it's so hard to get things done at the federal level. But at the level that we work in the states, at the level that VPP works in this community, you actually can demonstrate progress. And I think it's going to have an impact that reaches far beyond this community in terms of what it inspires others across the country to do.
Let me just build on your point about the accountability. And again, what I'm describing is something in process, and because of my involvement, I'll say it somewhat carefully, but we, at the Cleveland Clinic, we've had a CEO transition. Toby Cosgrove retired, and Dr. Tanya Mihaljevic, who was running the Abu Dhabi Center, is now the new CEO. In his first board meeting, which was really 30 days in Florida, we had some incidents in the clinic, and he just stepped forward and said, we are going to make the Cleveland Clinic the safest healthcare organization in the world for patients and caregivers. And I don't know if you know much about healthcare today, but one of the big dangers in healthcare is the threats to caregivers. It's irregular. It's not uncommon that you're confiscating guns in hospital emergency rooms today, or being attacked because people were on drugs when they come in. It's a whole different world out there. And if you go back, Paul O'Brien, when he was at Alcoa, used an approach where he actually said he found that Alcoa was stumbling as a corporation, and he found that by focusing that we will not have anybody die at Alcoa, he actually transformed the entire culture of the corporation. So right now at the Cleveland Clinic, this is actually a movement today, and Tommy, our CEO, is actually aggressively pushing something called Never. We have something called Never events. That's a wrong side body operation. That's a shot that shouldn't have been given, to reduce it to 0. We have 62,000 people. Okay, a number of countries in all that states. Imagine that target. And everybody knows that's the new target. So and people are beginning to rally around that point. So I think the point of accountability, where it's actually defined and internalized and understood by the culture, is a very powerful way to drive change in organizations.
But I guess just one other pivot point, for us at least, but we've seen this in common with a lot of other organizations, became the need to really understand the role of public policy in our work. So when we started the organization, frankly, we, and I include myself, had a very naive view of how we were going to end hunger in this country. We were going to raise money, on food banks, et cetera, et cetera. And then the longer we got at it, the more we realized hunger was something of the deep problem of poverty. And I've always felt that there are things that nonprofits can do that the government can't do in terms of innovating, in terms of taking risks, in terms of getting closer to the people we serve and learning from them. But I think there's also a point at which once you've built the best proof of concept, built the best mousetrap or model, you need public policy to scale it up. And we learned this in a very significant way at Share Our Strength. And we've never been partisan, but we've become a lot more political, at least in the policy sense of the word. So the best example I could give you is, and the day that the light bulb went off for me, was one of the things we work on is leveraging the existing federal food and nutrition programs. So we've got a school lunch program in this country that was set up by admirals and generals after World War II. That's where it started. It came back after the war in 1946. We testified before Congress that our troops, by the end of the long World War II, were not strong enough or fit enough to fight, and they urged Congress to create a school nutrition program. So we've got school lunch, and then a few years later, school breakfast came around. 22 million kids in the country get free or reduced price school lunch, 100% federally subsidized. All 22 million are eligible for breakfast. When we looked at this 8 years ago, only 9 million of the 22 million were getting breakfast. Lunch or they have breakfast, they have to get there earlier, maybe mom and dad can get you there, maybe the bus drivers are going to change their schedule. Maybe there's the stigma attached to being the kids to go to school early. In the summertime, when the schools are closed, only 3 million of the 22 million get. The crazy thing is bought and paid for all 22 million. An entitlement program is so small in the scheme of things, and so much bipartisan support for 50 years that it's exempt from sequestration. And I started to go around and talk to governors, and when I said the light bulb went off, the first governor I talked to was Governor Ritter of Colorado, who was the predecessor of the current governor. A Democratic governor, Corps volunteer in Zambia. And when I talked to Governor, I said that at the time, 8 years ago, Colorado ranked 47th lowest in the U.S. in terms of the percentage of eligible kids who were enrolled in these programs. And so he said, what does that mean? And I talked about all the negative impacts on the kids. I said, but it also means that you've left about $135 million in Washington that can only be used to buy milk from your dairy farmers and bread from your bakers and supplies from your vendors so that your kids do better in Colorado schools. And he looked at me, he was kind of dumbfounded, and he turned to his chief of staff and when he walks in the light and said, is that possibly true? And she did a little, yes, Governor, I'm afraid it is. And he said, well, why don't we need the guy in the blue blazer from Washington to come tell us that? How can that be? And I said some diplomatic version of it, if it had been a defense contract for $135 million, earmarked for Colorado as defense subcontracts are, somebody would have been in here a long time ago. I say this because what it said to me is that part of the problems are logistical, like I described with getting kids to school on time and so forth. A big part of them are political, again, not in a partisan sense, but these kids don't have a voice, right? And the kids that are represented in the VPP portfolio don't have a voice but yours. They don't vote, they don't make campaign contributions, they don't have lobbyists. They do have people like us that are willing to knock on doors and call superintendents and gather different convenings in the community so that they're represented. That's, when I say get political, that's the kind of political I mean, using our voice to advocate for plenty of good programs that actually already exist out there and some new ones that need to be brought into existence.
That's cool. We can switch to go Q&A real quick, but one thing, going back to something that we were asked to talk about, what's your take on how to best work with donors?
Well, that's something my take is
because maybe I say that I think Billy's done a remarkable job of pulling people together and winning them into support of the effort.
I think it's two things. I think one is it's kind of transparency and communication. But two, I think the most important thing, and this goes directly to the work that you do with the lead community, Mario, is the commitment to measuring impact and communicating the impact that you're having. I find that what either frustrates donors or sends them down the wrong path is when they look for some proxy to try to figure out whether you're an efficient or effective organization. And so the question we all get a zillion times is, what's your administrative overhead? Right. Okay, now in the history of the iPhone, nobody's ever walked into Apple and said, I want one of these, but I need to know what salaries do you pay out there in Cupertino? Right? How many people? What's your overhead at Apple headquarters? Nobody would ever ask it for a very simple reason. You buy this because it meets your need. You should invest in VPP or in Share Strength because it meets your need. And sometimes we're our own worst enemy in that if we don't invest in measuring impact, and that's an expense. If we don't invest in communicating the impact that we're having, that's an expense too. Then we just leave ourselves open to people not really understanding why their investment has the return that it has.
Okay. One thing I'll share, which actually has evolved over the years, and unfortunately I was reminded of this on Saturday, this past Saturday, my business partner, mentor, and teacher passed away in October, and Saturday was the celebration of his life, and I had the privilege of speaking. And one of the things I did was talk to the many lessons he taught me and others in the organization, and not just to make us better in business, but make us better as people. And one of the most profound was, he says, you always have to understand the want behind the need. And it's one of the most important messages he ever told me, because he says, people always give you a reason why they want to do something. He says, that's not the reason they want to do it. He says, what you need to do is get inside their head and find out, why do they emotionally want to do this? And that's no different than donors and funders and anybody. And I think when you're working with people, I think the more time you can spend with somebody to understand deeply why do they really want to do this is important. Joel had asked me to speak with somebody, who's a friend of ours, and just simply say, he's a relatively well-known anchor person. And I was talking to an individual, and it was actually right at the Madison Hotel where we normally meet for coffee. And they were walking me through all the things they're going to do if they decided to retire and everything. And they said, well, but I don't know what I could do in the social sector. I have no idea how I could apply what I do. Well, the person is a gifted communicator. And but as this individual was talking to me, they kept referring to a sickness of one member of the family. And it was it came back like every paragraph this would be mentioned. And so finally at the end, I said, you've already defined what you want to do. And she looked at me, what do you mean? I said, you've described it. Your passion, you mentioned this disease so many times, and you can see the passion, you want to do something about it. Why don't you take your skill of communication and being able to convince people and share with them, take that and help move the message of how we can find cures and raise money to help that particular issue. And she sat back stunned. And this was my point is, I think she was stunned because it's so simple. It's right in front of your face sometimes. Yet we confuse it with so many rationales and strategies and processes, and we don't get at what's in our heart and what we really want to do. So I think I'd encourage you, whether you're on the funder side or whether you're approaching it, take the time to know what is the real want behind the need they're expressing. It'll serve you well. So,
Want to open it up?
yeah, why don't we just, we're probably better if we just go Q&A, so we'd love the dialogue. So love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Billy, when you mentioned speaking to the 7th graders, you said one kid wanted to know if you mentioned the questions that were asked, but you didn't mention the answers, and I was interested in the answers you gave to the 7th graders about if the kids were seen or if they were invisible.
Yeah, I think the one question was, do we serve kids without embarrassing them?
Right.
And to that one, and I think probably these answers are related. In the first case, to us that's the whole idea behind kind of the systemic transformational change of using the schools, having universal meals, making sure that there are no distinctions between the kids, that there aren't kids who show up at one time because they need to be fed and other kids who don't need that. So for us that's important, is that every kid is treated the same. And the difference between that, obviously, and there are always going to be kids and families that fall between the cracks, but if you've ever been at a food bank or a soup kitchen when families are lining up to get the food they need, that's not a happy experience for them. That's not something that feels good for them. So we're obviously aiming more towards the systemic, because we just think there's a lot more respect and dignity in that. And then in terms of the kids being seen, probably the best way to think about Share Our Strength is as a general contractor with a lot of subcontractors. So in every community where we work, if a community, Virginia is a good example, we've added 60,000 kids to school breakfast in Virginia in just the last 3 years. And we've done that by working with lots of local partners in Richmond, Charlottesville, everywhere, that sign up to do a piece of it, and we sign up to fund it and guide them and share our best practices. But they are boots on the ground. I mean, they are in the schools. They are working with the kids. They literally know the kids by name. And we also spend a lot of time kind of pushing our board, our leadership council, our staff out into the community so that we stay connected to folks. I just came back 2 weeks ago from a couple days in San Francisco at Reading Elementary School and in the Tenderloin. And you see that stuff and you don't forget it. And I think I do it more for motivation than anything else, but you learn something every time you do it. And I think the people you're working with do feel seen in that regard.
No, if I can just add to Billy, he told me this is about the importance of bearing witness. Carol lives this, team lives this. You have to go, it's one thing to talk about, you're going to fund something, you're going to help somebody, but it's another thing to go meet them on their grounds, in their way. And number one, you're showing respect, that you're there. And don't do it one time because they do a dog and pony show on, but do it multiple times. And I think spending time to get a better appreciation of just what people are going through or kids are going through changes your view. It galvanizes you in many respects. It shocks you sometimes too, but you see reality. And I think that separates great donors from other donors. They have that perception to do that.
So I'm curious, in the states where you've been able to lift up the number of young people who've been having breakfasts, have you been able to measure the impact that it's had on their lives and on their educations?
Yeah, well, a little bit. Probably not as far, frankly, as we'd like to, partly because of the amount of time that we've been doing it. But we've measured it in a few different ways. We look at everything from test scores to attendance to tardiness to visits to the nurse's office. Deloitte did a big study for us. They found out that in the schools where we were working versus the control schools, math scores were up about 17%, which sounds amazingly high to me, but that's what they found, that attendance rates were up several days. And interestingly, when we did they did the study probably 3 or 4 years ago, but we've tuned it up a little bit since. But when we first unveiled it with their CEO at the time, Deloitte's CEO, Joe Echevarrias, we did this press conference in New York, and he said, I'm here for a couple of reasons to talk about this study. One is, you all know me as Joe Echevarrias, but I started here in PS 25 as Jose Echevarrias and lived on these food assistance programs. He said, but the main reason is, and I forget the exact number, but he said, I think it was Deloitte hires 30,000 young people a year, across their company. And he said, having a qualified pool of young people who have done well in school and so forth, he said that's becoming harder and harder to find. So we do try and measure it, all the way to the end of how did they do in college, that kind of thing. No, but we're constantly chipping away at that.
Could you guys talk a little bit, I recently started a nonprofit here, we're about, I guess 9-10 months into it, and we're just starting to think about board members, and we've got some interest, with various different board members. I'd love to hear your perspective on how, to assemble a board, your philosophy around that, the good number, what kind of people should be on the board, how early is it to engage, just kind of a strategy around that. It would be interesting to hear a little bit about that.
Well, I'll start off, and my answer is not going to be the one that I think most people do in the nonprofit field, because they typically populate their boards based on fundraisers.
Yeah.
I disagree with that. I've always disagreed with that. And let me explain why. I've been fortunate in my life to be the benefactor of great boards, the CEOs, and there's nothing you can replace to have that kind of power on a board. And I think what you do is you step back. What I learned is you ask, what do I need on a board at this time? And what's the makeup of that? And you don't go by personalities or people. You look at by what you need. Do I need linkage to public policy? Do I need linkage to high net worth people? Do I need linkage to educational systems? Do I need a counter executive who's doing this in another space? But what are those needs today? And then once you do that, then figure out who are the best candidates. Not the most popular candidates, not the ones on your agenda, but who are the best candidates. And then figure out a recruitment strategy, see if their philosophy aligns with yours to recruit them in. As far as size, I think it's very relative. You don't want to end up with the 20, 25, 30, 40 size boards. Clinic, we actually have 25, which is a lot. We sell, and we actually typically have 23, 24 people at every meeting. But the action's in the committees, in terms of, in all honesty, But I think, and then how your committee structure, depending on the size, is important. But to me, I'm watching one take place that they're obviously not listening to me, which is like not unusual, but because it's unpopular, because they're putting all the right names on. And they're going to pay a huge price, because those people won't get a damn thing done, because they won't help that CEO. And the other thing I think you have as a leader, and this is going to sound strange, I've always believed, no matter who you are as a CEO, you want somebody on that board who's going to push you. Somebody who's going to push you out of your comfort zone. Someone who's going to make you better as a CEO. And in turn, you're going to do the same thing for your staff. You have to have that constant, this is continuous talent improvement in effect. And if you don't have it on your board, you got a missing ingredient. That's my input to you.
Yeah. I think that's right on the mark. I guess my bias is that at least for starting out, smaller is better.
Yeah.
You can always add, and it becomes harder to subtract.
Yeah.
And I totally, so at Share Strength, for example, we've really, we're this year at about a $76 million organization, and we've never put anybody on our board based on a donation that they made. In fact, we have some large donors. None of them are on our board of directors. And the idea was to, first of all, not have somebody whose voice would be disproportionately loud or soft based on the amount of money they gave, but mostly to find people who were really just kind of passionately committed to what we were doing and had experience that we didn't have, particularly experience growing and managing a dynamic enterprise that we could learn from. And that's worked out pretty well for us. I think, the other lesson, and it sounds like just the way you're thinking about it, you'd be pretty good at this, is we found after making a number of mistakes along the way, you get out of your board what you put into it. So if you're willing to dedicate time and staff resources to really working with your board, making sure they're up to speed, making sure they know the direction you're going in, you get great stuff back. If you don't do that, you run into miscommunication and all the headaches you can imagine.
I really appreciate your insights for the good and the bad. The question I have on the ugly is the current legislation that was passed that has limited the amount of deductibility. And what impact do you think that will have on our charities? I've created charities here, and I've created them in places where there was no deductibility, and I can tell you, the level of giving is significantly reduced when citizens aren't induced or supported by their charitable giving. So I'm concerned that one big transformational change in the entire industry of philanthropy or charities will be a downward spiral in giving levels, and what we should be doing collectively to address that.
You want to try first?
I'll just say I share the concern. I think it's very, very disturbing. Our organization is a little different. I didn't spend a lot of time describing it except when I mentioned kind of corporate marketing partnerships, but I don't know enough about this because we're not very dependent on individual donors. We do a lot of cause-related marketing and things that are a little bit more insulated from traditional philanthropy. So I'm not really sure, but I absolutely share the concern that you've described.
I'm giving you a really loose opinion. It's not grounded in fact, and just some my own sense. One of the largest forms of giving is not the big numbers. It's the small giving. I think that goes unaffected because they're not giving it for the tax deduction. If you go back to the campaigns, for example, look at some of the campaigns this year, or even the Obama campaign, even some of the significant amount of money, millions and millions are raised, almost billions, on tiny donations. That money's not given on a tax basis. That's the money's given because of purpose. So you may have to broaden the way you go after small money in some respects. The other side gets into the type of donor you're dealing with. There are some that are going to be very driven by their family. I'm talking large donors now. They're driven by the family office mentality, and therefore tax savings will be a major factor. There are others that they don't give a damn because it's not going to matter to them. They're already getting an alternate minute tax. I mean, so that they don't get $1 million deduction. So what? I mean, that's change. I mean, I'm not being facetious, but I've sat in meetings of people talking huge amounts of money with no regard whatsoever to tax consequences. So I don't know if it's clear. I'm sure it's going to have a hit. There's no question there's an element in that. But I think it's unclear to how it's going to play out. That's all.
I mean, I think it argues, one point that you were making is it argues for trying to be as diversified in your revenue base as you can be, so you don't take any one big hit disproportionately. That's not right it's hard to generalize. That's obviously wouldn't be right for every organization. But over time, I think it's probably right for a lot of them.
You just add, Tim Delaney runs the Council of Nonprofits, and he's doing some excellent job in the lobby on the Hill. He was fiercely fighting this. His concern is the people who are in between what I just described. There's a lot of people that today that money does count to them. He feels there'll be a dip in that space that's significant.
Well, can you just, as a follow-up, share your more cause-related marketing fundraising model?
Yes, and it's, I'll begin by saying it's not for everybody. We did something really unusual when we started the organization. We said very intentionally, we're not going to have government money, we're not going to have foundation money, we're not going to have high donors, we're not going to do direct mail, we're going to make money. And so our long story short is because we work on hunger and we thought chefs and restaurateurs would have a connection to the issue since they feed people as their livelihood, we assembled a community of about 20,000 chefs and restaurateurs. And companies that are marketing into that community find that we're the most convenient way to do that. So for example, Citi will pay us $3 million a year to be the official credit card of Share Our Strength because they want the check presenter that comes to you at Equinox to say, we prefer Citibank MasterCard or whatever. And we have dozens and dozens and dozens of relationships like that, so that about, probably now, it used to be about 2/3 or 3/4, now it's a little over half of our revenue comes from these these types of partnerships. So we're not competing with brother and sister organizations for finite charitable dollars because we want to be granting to them. There's no strings attached to those dollars as long as we deliver the marketing value. Our core theory that developed is that most organizations, not all, but most, in the course of pursuing their mission, develop an asset that has a real monetary value. We didn't recognize ours at first, but we came to recognize there's a real monetary value in having 20,000 restaurateurs that will stock Evian if you ask them to stock Evian. You know, not all 20,000, but I can sign a contract with Evian knowing that on average 60% of the 20,000 will do what we ask them to. And I can be held to that by Evian. So, you know, again, it's a very different model. As we matured, we started to realize that kind of a world-class organization has to be better than more than just one thing. So we have developed a donor program now, and we have developed a very small donor base at the bottom of what we do. And we do have individual donors, but that was how we started, and I can give you a lot more information about it offline.
Billy, maybe I can pick up on that. That was, you talked about a starting point for transformational change being a set of bold aspiration. But, so what kind of implications did that have for your organization? What did you find you were good at that didn't matter as much anymore? Or what did you need to be good at that maybe you didn't have the strength that you needed organizationally?
Yeah. For us, Les, it created quite a shift because we were good at generating money and revenue in these entrepreneurial ways. That was really our core competency. And we gave it out, and we didn't really pay a ton of attention to how it was being spent. It was all being spent well by anti-hunger partners, but we just weren't, you know, that wasn't our focus. When we shifted and said, we're now going to be accountable, we needed a bunch of things that we didn't have before. We needed much more sophisticated grant-making expertise. We needed people with political and advocacy and policy skills. And we had to, in some cases, move some people out of positions they were in. In more cases, we had to say to folks, you know, everybody needs to slide on down the bench a little bit and make room for some talents and skills that we've never had here. So there was a culture management part of that was, you know, not easy for the organization to go through. People that were, 4 or 5 people that were at the core of everything now found that, you know, they weren't at the core of everything anymore. So it's a big change, and I think at every juncture you have to always be reminding yourself who your principal responsibility is to. In our case, to the kids we're trying to serve, so do things as compassionately and humanely as you possibly can, but don't not do them if it's going to interfere with the mission.
Les, this will be a page out of your book, but just to build on that again, not at the same level Billy did, but at VPP when I was there, and I'm sure Carol does this today, but in the experience I've had since, when you go into an organization to help them and they have this aspirational goal, getting them to put the mirror to their face to ask, do you have the right people in the right seats to do it is really a challenge, because they're not ready to deal with the answer, because that's where the culture change really takes place. And if there's a criticism I have or an opportunity I suggest for most organizations today, is that have that honesty, because I think everything is a function of leadership, people, and culture. The processes will work out. The methods will work out. If you got the right people in the right chairs, the right culture, you're going to get there. But if you make the mistake in the people, it won't matter what you do with the process. And getting that right up front and having the courage to do that up front, and you don't have to be demeaning, you don't have to be, you know, mercenary in doing it. You can have respect in how you handle people. But getting the right people, knowing what you need, not from what you had to get here, but who do you need for where you got to be, is a challenge to an organization to its growth. And also the opportunity for the change.
Got our closer on deck?
Oh, no.
I was very intrigued by an example you mentioned, how after World War II, it was the military that basically got this breakfast program. And I wonder, have there been recent examples of where the military came up with a program that actually benefited a large group of people here socially in the U.S.?
It's a good question. I'm only familiar even currently with the military's work on these nutrition issues. But I can tell you that, for example, about 18 months ago, the military put out a very important report about obesity. Only 25% of all American youth today are qualified and eligible to serve in the military because of either obesity, criminal records, or drug and alcohol issues. But obesity is actually the leading factor of those three. So the military has stayed very focused on fitness, nutrition, health. There's a retired lieutenant general named Mark Hartling, who I spoke to a while ago, and he was telling us as part of his trajectory through the military, he got put in charge of all basic training. And the first thing he found was that there was a whole series of everything from shin splints to broken bones to dental issues that were keeping recruits off the field. And so he did this major rework of their training. There's probably other examples too around education. I don't know them, but it's a really interesting question.
Two questions. One, I wanted to ask you more about the culture. I find that a lot of foundations and organizations are subject to incredible amounts of organizational ego, which often prevents them from moving beyond what, looking at the mission as opposed to looking at their own survival. So I wanted to know a little bit more about how you break through that organizational ego and begin to break down those silos and break down their focus on, oh, I've got the right answer and I'm going to do it and I'm going to continue to do what I do because I see from my own examples that it works rather than based on data. So there's a step beyond that. So I'm curious to know how organizations move beyond that, and quite frankly on the foundation side as well. They're used to supporting certain things in certain ways, and they all, and really, prevent them from stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. And then the other question is really within foundations, there is an increasing interest in, particularly among the younger generation, to look at what the 95% is doing, not just the 5% that they give away. And are there interesting opportunities, and how do you, as organizations, work with those foundations to think about the 95%, not just the 5% that's given away?
Well, let me try the first one if I can. You seem to ask it from two standpoints. One is it organizations in general or strictly foundations in terms of the culture issue?
Both of them, I'm talking about both, they each have their organizational egos, foundational egos and organizational.
Well, I think, let me just speak generically to an organization. I don't think you define culture. Culture is defined to you, and then you have to work with it. I think people don't, you just can't come in and, I had one organization, they did all these signage and posters, and no one gave a goddamn. I mean, no, honestly, because you weren't at the people level. You weren't talking to people. You weren't dealing with it. And I think if the leader doesn't lead by example, nothing happens. So if you want to have a culture, it's got to start with that CEO. And that culture has to set it. Now, it may take a long time, and there's processes you go through to cultivate that organization and move that organization. But I think everything is lead by example. I had an interview the other day, and the kid, the man who was interviewing, made the comment that he gets upset when no one picks a piece of paper up off the floor. That used to be one of my culture tests in my own organization. If somebody would walk by a piece of paper, I knew they did not give a damn about the company. And they got a career mark on it. The person who cared, you know what did they pick that? They picked that paper and they put it in the trash can. You look at culture in small ways, what they do in small things. And I think the leader has to set that, you have to walk the talk. If you want to model behavior, you want the behavior, you have to model that behavior. And then you have to do things inside to make it conducive. You have to make it rewarding. You have to celebrate when it happens properly. And again, go back to the Clinton cases, we now have people going on what we call leadership rounds. And if you're a board member or a donor, you can go on a leadership round in the morning. You show up at 7 o'clock in the morning, you're briefed, you go out and you see patients, you talk to nurses. And when you come back, you know what they're doing? They're celebrating 2 or 3 caregivers for something special that caregiver did that morning to help a patient. And boy, does it really help in the culture definition. So I think Culture, I think, is all about people. It's about listening to people. It's about setting the value and getting people on board with the values of what you're trying to do. You have to get agreement on values. It sounds so corny, but to get people sitting there to talk together and say, hey, these are our core values, and we all really buy into these and have a process by which they do that so they own it and then live it is, I think, so essential to culture development. Just I mean, my own thing. But I can't get past one point. The CEO sets that example and has to walk that talk, or else there's no game. Now, on funders, whole different ballgame. I want to take my hat off. I think Carol and team has done a marvelous job of working with a number of foundations very constructively. Getting foundations to change is hard from the outside. And I think part of the problem is that there's no levers, there's no gimmicks, there's nothing, there's no change, outside of spending 5% a year, there is no other leverage point. We started this, we're working with something called Lead Ambassadors Community, which is a community of leaders here in the country and internationally. And the question is, how do you get funders to help nonprofits be stronger, more effective? So they'll put money in, they'll put systems in. It's hard. There's not many donors are doing that today. We have so many people who say, well, you go in and you got to tell them what to do. You don't tell a foundation what to do. Yeah, because they don't have to listen to you, first of all. I mean, number one. You can make a rational argument, but it takes time. So we've concluded that one of the things we've noticed is that funders tend, if they listen to somebody, they listen to other funders, especially funders of their own class. So I'll use an example, not the pitch, but so one of the things we did is we started saying, could we start running a series of profiles of funders that showed really healthy examples of how a funder was working really constructively to help their grantees. And we started with Einhorn Charitable Trust in New York City. We did input from private equity fund in London. We've just finished Duncan Campbell in Oregon, who is a philanthropist, Friends of the Children. Remarkable stories. We're getting 2,000 downloads on these stories, but they're really positive stories. And we built up a distribution base, and we now have 20,000 contacts in funder communities with these stories every time we push. Tomorrow, the story goes out, and I'll do the pitch. 50,000 people tomorrow, Venture Philanthropy Partners, the network effect. Because we're telling the story of how VPP has changed how to work in communities to pull people together to see constructive change. Now, does everybody buy into this? No. Our feeling, though, is you have, when you talk about that entrenched organization, that's real, very real. But one of the people who put us on to something 2 years ago said, but there's now younger program officers in these places, and you need a beachhead. And so you don't walk in and tell a president of a foundation what to do, but if you can gradually chip away, if you can bring merit to the argument, if you can keep pushing to one who's receptive, build the case that it's a long-term change. There's no short argument to this. Faye Twersky's with the Hewlett Foundation, definitely a highly respected individual field. She said that over the years, to try to get foundations to use the information, she didn't browbeat anybody. What she did is each time she met with the program officers, in addition to reporting what they wanted, she showed them how she was collecting information in support of what they did. And it was a gradual, very quiet, gradual education process over time to where they ended up seeing more about what they did. Nancy Rube, Edna McConnell Clark, she pulled off aggregated growth spot. All of a sudden, foundations were coming together, unheard of, to share the same reporting process. One reporting process for 9 foundations teaming on a grant today. It was a process. It took time to convince people on a meritocracy-based argument, showing facts over time. No quick solutions. I mean, it is tough, very tough. It's probably the toughest thing I've encountered, in all honesty, because there's no reason for change, and you have to work assiduously at doing that. That's my take on it. If you want to.
Can't improve on that. The only other reference point I'd give you for your second question is a woman, Mario and I both know, named Clara Miller, who's, right. If you Google her, she's doing a lot of great work on impact investing on that other 95%. Clara Miller.
Yeah, Clara's the one also came out and, like she said, she wrote the Terrarium, yep. and basically it's to break the wall down between financial investment and mission investment in institutions today. And it's a brilliant piece. And it has caused some meaningful discussion in boards across the country today. So.
Oh, this is good. The light's bright here. I've got 24-point type. It's all good. So thank you so much for sharing your insights. I'm thrilled to even briefly be sharing a stage with you because you guys are my mentors. With regard to Share Our Strength, I have to say the thing that changed the dialogue around hunger for me was at a Share Our Strength program where they described snow days. And the story was, for my kids, a snow day is like, yay, we don't have school. Well, for a kid who's hungry, it's like there's no food. And that just immediately touches your heart. So thank you for what you do. Just today, I said to someone what I said many times, which is that it's very hard to give money away well. And Mary, you've been my inspiration and my educator in so many ways on how to structure my philanthropy to create change. And you wrote the book on it, so very literally. So whether I'm working with a nonprofit I started, or granting to a nonprofit, or deciding where to write a check, I've used the lessons taught by Mario and by VPP to inform my work. Several of my sisters in 100 Women Strong are here tonight, and I will publicly admit how much I structured our grant process and our evaluations, and, well, frankly, completely stolen your work. How we grant money, how we support, encourage, and fund collaboration between nonprofits, for-profits, and governments, in order to solve problems. I mean, totally because of you, so thank you. And yeah, I did steal it all, and you know, see, now they thought I was brilliant, but it's really just Mario. So we all want to know that the money we give is accomplishing something important and creating positive change. There's no way to be certain of this without requiring accountability and fiscal responsibility. But this needs to be paired, as you heard, with bold and creative thinking that seeks to solve a problem. The best examples of this, obviously, are Share Our Strength and VPP, so we're very lucky. And I don't want to belabor the point, but something that you didn't talk about that was a very important lesson I learned from you, Mario, is when it came time for me to step down graciously as a founder, and let others continue working to promote school readiness for preschoolers, I had to look at how graciously you stepped down from VPP and let your team step in and continue your work, which was just amazing. You really empowered your team to take the reins and grow. It's a mark of a true and exceptional leader when he can plan himself out of a job and then the organization continues to flourish. That's a real gift. It absolutely does. So thank you both for teaching me, for enabling my philanthropy. And for those of you who are not yet invested with VPP, take a closer look. Because to say that VPP employs best practices is a huge understatement, because those best practices were invented here. And now they're out in the world in other organizations. So thank you so much, and thank you all for being here.
Join me in thanking Karen, Mario, and Billy again for being here this evening. I'd like to thank all of you for taking your time to be with us, and I think I promised informative, engaged, and provocative, and I think we got that tonight. But I also want you to join me in thanking the VPP team. I know I don't thank them enough for what they do every day to improve the kids' lives in this region, but also to make sure we have wonderful evenings like tonight. So thank you to the VPP team.